Hello, Alyssa. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
I am, it's not too often that truly random people that I've never heard of in the realm of strength training message me. And then within a couple exchanges, I'm like, did we just become best friends? But I feel like I have so much connection to so many of the things that you talk about. I am so glad that you reached out on Instagram and that we've sort of gotten to know each other a little bit. So thanks for being here.
Me too. And honestly, if I've learned one thing from the process of book publishing, it is that if you are not your own best advocate, nobody else will be. And so I am out there just shamelessly messaging people that I admire and being like, hi, can I come talk to you? Can we do a podcast? Can we do an interview?
Truly, I mean, the like having a book and then having to promote said book, people think, okay, so you write the book is published, and then you're like, ta-da. But that's not how it goes.
No. Once you finish the hard work of writing the book, you then get to do the extra hard work of being a shameless self-promoter. It's a whole
Uh-huh.
separate thing.
Yeah, and we'll probably go at a timeline here, but what was it like to decide to write a book on this topic? I mean, were you sort of jonesing to just get this out there, or did it evolve a little bit more organically kind of along the way? Like, what was the impetus for putting this down on paper for posterity's sake?
Well, when I had the idea for this book at first, it was super specific to strongman. It was literally, I wanted to write a book on the history of strongman. I thought this was the most fascinating thing, and it was going to be this window into this subculture and the history of it. And I'm very lucky that I have an author friend who was like, that sounds fascinating. That audience is incredibly small. And it was like, I think you're kind of letting the stuff you want to nerd out on get in the way of what you think is going to sell a book. And so then it morphed into, okay, it's going to follow my journey to uncover the history of this sport. And then the more that I kind of started to dig into that and add my personal element of it, the more that it became, the part that seemed to resonate the most with anybody that I was talking to about it. They were like, well, okay, but how did you get into strength? And how did you come to understand the importance of the pursuit of strength and how it impacts your life? And so then it just became this incredibly personal thing that ultimately ended up being what I call like part memoir slash personal narrative and part research mission, because it truly is this combination of both. So it's me kind of searching for answers as to why strength matters so much to me. And to do that, I went out into the world of strength, and specifically all the way into the world of strongman at kind of the fringe end of strength, to interview all these athletes, both professional and amateur, and then researchers and psychologists and coaches, and sort of say, okay, well, we know physical strength matters for our bodies, right? Like that I think most of us understand that, but how else does it impact our lives? So the book is so, there's very little about what it does physically to your body and your muscles, and almost exclusively about how it impacts everything else you do in your life outside of a gym setting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the more I kind of read more about you, and our lives aren't totally the same. You have some distinct differences in sort of, really how strongman helped you get through some things in life, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But there were so many parallels, and I just thought I need to have you on the show and talk about some of these things. And I'm just going to hold up the book and show it so people can take a look. So
Yay.
Secrets of Giants, really, really cool. If nobody listening to this show has heard of strongman, because I don't think I'm trying to do the math here and kind of go back in the mental archive. We've got 430 something episodes. Maybe somebody who's like dabbled in strongman here or there, but if somebody listening to this show has never heard of this genre of strength training, how would you define or describe it?
Yeah. So I would say first, I often tell people, like, okay, maybe you're not sure that you've heard of it, but do you ever remember sitting down and watching like late night ESPN with your parents? And there's these like huge dudes and they're pulling trucks and picking up giant boulders and flipping tires and all that crazy stuff. Like that's strongman. It's been around since the 70s. So there's a good chance that at some point you've either watched or you've heard some of the names of like the big kind of all-time well-known guys, Zadruna Savickas, Mariusz Pudzianowski, Bill Kazmaier, these big, big guys. I mean, Lou Ferrigno competed in the very first World's Strongest Man competition, and everyone knows who the Hulk is.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of loosely define strongman as picking up heavy and odd objects and then either putting them back down, lifting them over your head, throwing them, or carrying them for a distance or a finite amount of time. So that might be a truck. That might be an Atlas stone. That might be a keg that you're either throwing or putting over a bar or putting over your head. Sometimes it's just a barbell that you're deadlifting, but more often than not, it's something a little bit out of the ordinary of what you would see in the gym. So if you look at like Olympic lifting, which has its 2 basic lifts, and powerlifting, which has its 3 basic lifts, strongman, it's kind of everything. You will, in a competition, you'll see a press of some kind, a lift of some kind, a carry of some kind, probably a pull of some kind, but it could be totally different from one competition to the next.
Thanks for that. I'm sure we'll put up some kind of video, something I can find and link to, especially on YouTube,
Yeah.
if no one's really seen these competitions. They're pretty entertaining, and just leave you with a sense of awe at
Yeah.
what people are able to do. Being as I have competed in both Olympic weightlifting and to a smaller extent powerlifting, I would say I would define Olympic lifting as like the nerdy sort of like serious lifting. Powerlifting, and we're being very stereotypical here, powerlifting is like the metal, like fucking rock on, like
Yeah.
just raw. And
Yeah.
then what would you call strongman as? Like, what's the vibe of strongman if you were to go into the
Oh,
average gym?
strongman is the dirtbag sport. It's just like, what shit can you find
Yeah.
and pick it up? Like, you can train for strongman by just going outside and just finding something and picking it up, and you will be doing some version of strongman. There is this really incredible guy out there right now, Tom Haviland, who he doesn't show his face on Instagram, and his whole deal is he kind of like goes out and just picks up stuff in nature. And he could probably be up there as one of the top strongmen if he ever decided to compete. Some of the stones that I have in my home are just stones I yanked out of the ground in my backyard. It's what kind of drew me to it more than anything else. I had tried Olympic lifting. I'd never done powerlifting like per se, but I've trained all of those lifts. And Olympic lifting was very precise for me. I like that with strongman, we kind of joke that the only rule is that you can't sumo deadlift. And beyond that, like there's kind of no other rules. Like get the thing over your head, however you can get the thing over your head.
Sure.
Your elbows don't have to be locked out at when you lift it. Yes, to show that you've got control over it, absolutely. But it's not that level of precision, and it's so DIY. I mean, you hear these stories from guys who were at the top of their game who just had their own stuff, had replicas of equipment made for them because you can't, for the most part, go out and buy this stuff. So you have someone like Mark Henry who won the first Arnold Strongman Classic, and he had to do this thing called the Apollon's wheels, which is like a really thick barbell, like an axle bar with these wagon wheels on the end, and it doesn't spin. And he had one welded together for him.
Mhm.
Magnus for Magnuson made these like handles that he wanted to see, had them welded. Mitchell Hooper, who was Canada's first world's strongest man, he needed this thing called a fingal finger, which is like a large hollow telephone pole that you have to flip. And he was working out of a commercial gym, and he just had this like giant plank of wood attached to this thing and was just flipping that back and forth in the gym. So there's something I think really endearing about how do it yourself it is.
Yeah, very MacGyver sort of. You can
Yes.
make it happen if you're
Yeah.
creative enough and have some things laying around. And we were sort of talking on Instagram about stone lifting and some of the classic sort of
Yeah.
stones of Europe, Scotland, those sorts of things, and kind of nerding out on that. And even seeing sort of those versions show up in things like is it Rogue Record Breakers, where they were sort of lifting Diddy stones and things like that. Even the sort of sandbag replicas of the Husafel and things
Yes.
of that nature. So it's cool to see that it's starting to show up that way. But to your point, I don't know, can you just go pick up some heavy shit?
You can, and that's what's so rad about it. I mean, listen, one day I would love to travel to all the historical stones and, get a chance to lift those. But yeah, for now, it's cool because you can replicate these things in some way, the owner of the gym that I started training at in Brooklyn, called a Global Strongman Gym, Hans, literally, that's his name. He got these handles, like the Dinny rings that Rogue made replicas of, and he attached them to two big boulders. And they're totally different weights, but it's like a nice way to train what that feels like to move
Hmm.
those.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, okay, so we're gonna take a side quest. I know that you have a variety of different sort of athletic experiences in your background. You also wrote in the book that growing up, you didn't think that you were built for playing sports. And over the years have done all sorts of different things, endurance, CrossFit. I mean, kind of take us through, like, how do you go from a kid who didn't really feel like you were athletic or built for this to somebody who's literally kind of now made it this very essential part of your life to participate in sports or athletics or things that kind of like tick that box for you.
Yeah, I mean, I was, to your point, I was this kid who, I started out playing Little League baseball. I have this really strong memory of never hitting the ball at all, and kind of feeling like mortified by the fact that I had tried to be this tough kid who could play this sport with the boys, and then really kind of shitting the bed in it. And I was 10 years old. And I immediately went to this place of going, okay, well, maybe you're just like not athletic. Maybe you're just not coordinated. And maybe you're not cut out for sports. Instead of doing what someone else might have done, which is saying to their parents, hey, can you work with me? Can I learn a little bit more about this? I didn't do that. I created this story. And I believed that story for 10 years of my life. And then I was in my early 20s and I had a phone call with my mom where I basically learned that it wasn't that I had like swung and missed the ball all those times. I had apparently just stood there in fear and never even swung the bat. And I was, maybe 21, 22 when I heard that. And it was this moment of going, oh my God, I've created this persona for myself as this person who can't do these things. And as it turns out, I'm actually just the kind of person who is so scared of failure they don't try. So that really set me off on this course of going, okay, well, what could I do if I actually tried? And I started training for all these things that I had no experience in. So I always feel like I have to make that super clear to people. Like, I was not an athlete. I'm not a natural athlete, and I wasn't an athlete growing up. So in my 20s, I decided I'm going to run a marathon. I had not run a mile. And then I ended up going on to run 6 of them. I decided to do a triathlon, even though I couldn't swim a lap in the pool. And I went on to do an Ironman. And then I found my way to CrossFit, even though I hadn't really ever lifted weights. And it was CrossFit that kind of took me to strongman. And more so than anything else I had done, strongman really showed me that actually failing was really okay and kind of awesome, because it was the only way to understand what I actually could do, right? After telling myself for all those years, you're not capable of these things. Now I threw myself into a sport where I was only going to find out if I was capable of doing something by doing it and failing at it. Because then you can backtrack from that and go, okay, I'm not ready for that yet, but like I'm ready for one step before that. So you can't deadlift 300 pounds. So backtrack from that. What could I do if I pushed up to that level safely, obviously,
Mhm.
and then I backtrack and go, okay, could I do, last time I did 270. And so now I'm going to do, 5 pounds more than that. And I know what my goal is and I know where that limit is now. And can I keep training and push past that?
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And I love what you're saying there about failure and sort of that being information. And I think that that's a really tough thing for a lot of people to wrap their brains around. And it's, I think, also one of the reasons why so many people will come in to lift with, in my program or something like that, or they're just out there and we're like talking about jujitsu or something. And they're like, oh, yeah, but I'm not really an athlete. I'm not really athletic. And so I don't know, to what degree do you think that that sort of goes along with like there has to be some level of proficiency or some kind of standard? Like, hey, recently we were talking in my group about, I heard that I should be able to back squat my body weight if I'm strong enough. And I was like, where did that even
What?
come
Yeah.
from?
Strong enough
You
for
know,
what?
yeah, so it's sort of like how do you, I guess the question would be like, how do you explain or define what it means to you to be an athlete or athletic?
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you see yourself as an athlete, you're an athlete. And there was a great article, I'm not remembering now where it was, but there was this concept of like whether, if you define yourself as someone who is an athlete, you will train like you are an athlete. But if you define yourself as somebody who isn't, then everything that you do to approach the way that you work out is going to be under that lens, right? So, like, yeah, I never felt that way about myself until I started racing. And then I was like, okay, now I'm an athlete. And it wasn't that I was competitive. I never won a single race that I entered. It was just that was how I decided to define myself. Instead of defining myself as somebody for the previous 10 years who wasn't athletic, it was just that like little shift in mindset that gave me the courage to actually do it. You know,
Mhm.
I'm not a huge proponent. I say this a lot of like manifesting things. I think you really have to go out and work for things, but you do have to believe that you are that person, and then you have to go for it. So
Mhm.
it's got to be a little bit of both.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll link to one of the previous podcasts I've done sort of on that concept of really deciding kind of what is the identity you want to lean into and how that's going to be a driver of the routines and habits you create and then ultimately the outcomes that you get. Um, I know you were talking about running. I've only done one marathon because I was like one and done. Like
Yeah.
I'm good. That was me personally. How is running a marathon or doing an Ironman or something like that for you different compared to lifting heavy things in terms of how it feels to do hard shit?
I think they're both up there as being really hard. It's just in one, you're kind of sitting in the suck for a lot longer. Like you're just sort of existing in this they call it the pain cave. Like you're just existing in this place of discomfort for hours. But I think with both, it's a bit of a mindset shift too, right? So when I did the Ironman, the only goal I set for myself, other than finishing, was I wanted to run the marathon with a smile on my face. And that was because I couldn't control flat tires. I couldn't control if my legs were going to be tired. Like there was just stuff that I wasn't going to be able to do anything about. But I could control reminding myself, like, okay, the only goal you have for these 26.2 miles is to smile. And that helped me kind of change the way that I was looking at everything that I was doing. And I feel the same with lifting. It's like when you miss a lift, you choose how you're going to react to that. So are you going to get really mad at yourself and throw the barbell down and walk out of the gym? Or are you going to go, okay, I'm not there yet, but I will be? Or, oh, bummer, I've gotten this lift before, but I'm not getting it today. And, that doesn't say who I am as a person or who I am even as an athlete. It changes. It's just how are you going to be next time you go in? And are you willing to kind of take that one little mistake, or that one failure, and come back again the next time? And that, I think, defines whether or not you're a person who will do hard things like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I can I can relate to being an endurance mountain bike racer,
Yeah.
which is kind of the last stuff I was doing in the endurance world, alongside some Xterra, which is basically like an Olympic distance triathlon, but off road. But the endurance distance mountain biking was another beast in and of itself because you're out there for hours and hours and hours and you're like alone with your thoughts and it's it's just like
Yeah.
this, can I sit in the suck, and it's different. I know you were talking about in the book about how straight like strength training, lifting heavy things, like there's an element of getting comfortable with the discomfort. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, like, what did you uncover through your conversations, your research, and even through your own experience about dancing, like flirting with that edge of like being uncomfortable versus wanting to retreat back to a comfort zone and something that felt more approachable.
Yeah, I mean, my coach actually has said one of the best things about this, which is that, the more that you purposely do these difficult things, and in our situation, that's in the gym, that's strength training, and that's putting yourself in these kind of positions where things are really, really hard, the easier all the stuff that you encounter in your daily life starts to feel because you already know that you're somebody who can endure these hard things, right? And yes, this is going to be something different that you're encountering outside of the gym, but you start defining yourself as a person who can do difficult things. And then conversely, the more you avoid doing those hard things, the harder even the easiest things start to feel, right? So it's just, I think, again, it goes back to like, what's the story you tell yourself about who you are? Are you a person who can overcome those kinds of things, or are you a person who quits, and goes, okay, like this is too hard for me. I can't do this. So, I mean, I'm a parent of two little girls, and one of the things that we talk about all the time in my house is we don't say I can't. We say I'll try. And I
Mm,
say that to them like a broken record all the time, which is, don't tell me that you can't do this thing. And it can be something as stupid as like, I can't open my toothpaste tube. And I'm like, well, did you try it first? If you've tried it first and you think, okay, now I will come and help you. But like, let's give it a shot. Let's give yourself, the ability to do those things on your own, as small as they might be, just because then you know that you've given it a shot.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's tough because there can be so much discomfort in all of the periphery around lifting, just with life and the things that we go through, especially in middle age, I feel like is just a test of resilience in and of itself and all the things that are going on. And it's sort of like training that element in a, I used to think about why do people love things like CrossFit, or jujitsu? Like you're
Yeah.
getting folded in half while you're wearing pajamas. Why do we keep coming back? And it's because it's this like community, like suffering together, but in kind of like a more controlled situation.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there's just something about it that you're like, what is so attractive about this? It's
Oh,
hard.
absolutely. I mean, listen, we talk about CrossFit being a cult, right? And I truly believe that like a big part of that is because people who do CrossFit just want more people to do CrossFit because it's so awesome and they want more people in their community. There's a lot of cultish language around it, but there is this element of shared suffering that comes from doing stuff like this with other people. I work out most days of the week on my own. I have a gym in my garage. And when I go and I compete, that's when I really feel that sense of community. And I think you push yourself a lot harder in those situations because we are, in a way, kind of hardwired to work together and to go through that shared suffering and to be stronger because we all have to do that for each other. Like I've never experienced in any other sport the level of camaraderie that you get in the sport of strongman. And I think it is because everyone who is there to push the potential of what humans can do, not just what they can do themselves. And
Mhm.
so if you can't get something that day, but someone you're competing with can, it's just so awesome to see them do something that is like past the limits of what you thought human potential was. And
Mhm.
you see this at the highest level of the sport too. I mean, some of the guys I talked to were like, listen, if someone's belt breaks at World's Strongest Man, like we're going to lend him ours because I don't want to beat you on a technicality. I
Mhm.
want to beat you at your best and I want to see you do your best so that I know what the best looks like. And that I think is really powerful.
So freaking wholesome.
It,
Like,
honestly, it really is.
you're just like, how is it so wholesome? But it's so awesome. Yeah, to really be out there and like you said, pushing the boundaries. One of my very best friends, shout out to Becky. She we met actually before freshman year of high school, and we're still really amazing friends. And she participates in strongman stuff, and I don't do strongman. I mean, I've lifted some Atlas stones and done some axle work here and there, but never competed. And every time I see what she does, I'm just like so fucking excited. I'm so psyched on the things that she's able to do, like deadlifting, the front of a car and like all pulling a truck. And like you said, all the things
Yeah.
that people do is so fucking cool and just awesome to see people out there putting themselves to the test in that way.
Absolutely. And I think also, there is this sense of, I interviewed the founder of Barbend, and he said this thing that really resonated with me, where he was like, when you watch somebody do something that's really hard, he's like, I'm never going to know what it feels like to be LeBron James and be able to dunk a ball. But he's like, I do know to an extent what Eddie Hall's going through when he's going for that world record deadlift. And when you watch someone do that, you also get this sense of what you might be capable of at some point. Um,
Mhm.
one of the most fascinating things, that I didn't get to include this in the book, that I learned about was this idea of mirror neurons, where if you ever watch somebody doing something and you've done it before, or some version of it, and you find yourself, like, you're watching someone deadlift and you find yourself like pulling your shoulders back or like clenching your hands or whatever that is, it's because your brain is kind of connecting to that and trying to mirror what they're doing. And that does bond you to that person too, even if they don't know that you're feeling bonded to them.
Oh, I love that. I know that you did a ton of research about the history of strongman and obviously have participated in it yourself. And you were talking about writing the book, not specifically from a women's perspective. You wanted to talk to all sorts of athletes, but I am wondering if you found out anything really interesting or noteworthy about women's participation in this sport, or anything around that, since this podcast is specifically looking at women in strength. What did you find out about that you would like to share? Anything interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most powerful things I learned, and I don't always love to bring all this back to like aesthetic stuff, but it was really incredible to hear from so many women that they said, doing a strength sport taught me that I could love my body not for how it looks, but for what it is capable of doing. And there's so many women who, went into this kind of looking for, okay, how can I, whittle this down or make this smaller, who then learned, oh my God, the goal of the sport is to be bigger. Like, how cool is that? There's one of the women, Inez Carrasquillo, who is just incredible and one of the strongest women. She talks about how the first time that she went into a powerlifting gym, she walked in the door and the head coach of that gym came running up to her and was like, "You are the biggest woman I've ever seen. I want you on my team." Now, that would rattle a lot of women, but for her, it was kind of this revelation of like, this, he's saying this to me in a revelatory way. Like, he thinks that this is awesome. And I think that becomes incredibly powerful. We're taught as women, if you want to go into lifting, typically someone's going to say to you, "Ugh, don't lift or you're going to get bulky." Or you're going to hear, um, you can lift, but you won't get bulky. But either way, we're suggesting it's this negative thing, right? And that, I think, is where that problem lies, is, and we talked about this a little bit offline, but like, you wouldn't tell a guy not to get too bulky. You wouldn't tell a guy to go for muscle tone. Why are we telling women this? Like, human beings need muscle mass and muscle strength to survive and to thrive. So why are we telling one gender versus the other that they get to look a certain way and the other one shouldn't look that way?
Yeah, it's one of the things that drives me the most bananas, is, and obviously it's nuanced, but this idea of the fact that there are such different, even just words that we use when it comes to women in lifting, or women in strength training, or in fitness in general, versus
Yeah.
men. And I'm mentioning that in a binary because that's just typically how we see things. But knowing that there's a whole universe in between. But I see this a ton where, people are like, "Oh, but I don't hear anybody saying we shouldn't get bulky." And I'm like, "Where are you hanging out? Because I want to be
Yeah.
part of that place. That sounds like a
Yeah,
great
me
place."
too.
I know in your sort of talking to more people and looking at this aspect of like, don't get bulky, or, don't take up more space.
Yeah.
What did you find out, or what did you sort of come to the conclusion about? Because we were talking about, it's maybe not just about the size that could be the issue, but other things around it. So, you know, what did you talk to folks about with that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just about kind of creating that level of not just like acceptance, but love for what they're capable of doing. And, I think especially some of these women, as we get older, we're thinking more about what does this mean for our longevity? And for so many generations, women were taught, and it's this crazy thing that I went through in the book of like what our bodies have been expected to look like for the past, 2 centuries. And it is wild that we have wanted to change the ideal body back and forth so many times at this speed that far outpaces the human body's ability to actually change its shape. We're saying to women, okay, be really slim. And then it's like, oh, it's wartime. Now we need you to be big and strong so you can do these jobs that were traditionally held by men. Oh, but the men are coming back now. So now you got to go back to being slim. And it's kind of gone back and forth like this. And if anything, now we're maybe in a bit of a heyday where we're a little more accepting of things, but there is still this like invisible line at which, we decide that a woman is strong versus like freakishly bulky.
Hmm.
And that line has not really changed that much over time. Um,
Hmm.
but what I think is incredible is talking to women now, especially women who are my age and older, that we're starting to understand, we have to kind of push back against this narrative that we are supposed to be smaller because we know now, we've had enough studies come out now to say if you are not strength training in some capacity, I don't care if it's resistance bands, I don't care if it's a jug of water in your house. But if you are not resistance training in some capacity, you are going to lose muscle mass and muscle strength as you get older. Your bone density is going to go down, which it's going to do no matter what, unless you are doing this kind of training. And then you get into a situation as you get older where now you're at greater risk of falls, you're at greater risk of fractures, you're at greater risk of losing your independence.
Yeah.
And nobody wants that.
Yeah. It's a really interesting conversation. And I think one that we need to keep having, right? This idea that being bulky is somehow inconvenient
Yeah.
in some way, or it's, undesirable. Why is it undesirable, right? We had to kind of keep, I think, bringing that up and having those conversations and slowly picking away at things. And obviously there are so many layers there, and just even going back and looking at the history. And I have a book called Venus with Biceps. I don't know if you've ever seen
That's
this book.
where
Yeah.
that's where a lot of that research came
Yeah.
from, was from that book. It was fascinating.
Yeah, super super cool book. And then also sort of this idea that, you know, there were these women who were these amazing, and like this had these amazing physiques and stuff, and they were like, but oh no, these are the freaks. Like they're literally in the circus or in a sideshow or some kind of attraction, because it was just like nobody had ever seen this thing before.
Well, and that's why they were okay, right? That's why, Katie Sanduina could exist the way that she did, and Minerva could exist the way that she did, was because they were not in your home.
Yeah.
Right? They weren't existing as, wearing the pants in your home. They were in this circus setting. And, every time that they were mentioned in stories about their athletic feats, it was also mentioned that they were, wives and mothers. And that was the story that we had to tell about them. You've got all these photos of Katie Sanduina doing all these incredible things, but you don't have photos of her flexing her biceps.
Hmm. Yeah, I know. It's it's fascinating and terrifying all at the same time. And I mean, I hope things continue to change, and books like yours and what you're talking about and just opening the dialogue and really looking deeply at things, I think is so important. I know that, there's, I think, a fine line for people. And I can very much relate to this idea of being an endurance athlete and feeling like I was never small enough,
Yeah.
and finding lifting and thinking like, holy shit, I get to, you know, explore like all these things I can do, like, and it's not dependent on me being as tiny as I can possibly
Yeah.
be, and how freeing that was. I also know the other side of the coin for people is sometimes thinking, what if I start to pin so much of my self-worth or identity on what I can do? And I think about um, just folks that even have injuries, folks who have disabilities, um, people who have illnesses that have changed their ability to be physical and what they're able to participate in. And I'm wondering, like, how do you think about that sort of thing? Like, are we trying to put all of our eggs in one basket here and saying like, oh, or we'll feel great if we can only do these things and do hard things? Or is it sort of a stepping stone on the way? Like, how do you think about those sorts of issues
Yeah.
that come up?
Well, I think there's, a danger in anything that you're doing to an extreme level of defining yourself, like creating your identity around that, right? And so that was me when I was running, and then I would get injured. I would get stress fractures, and I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm not a runner now. Who am I?" And so in general, I think, it's important that strength as well is part of your identity, but not your entire identity. But it's also important that, we think about the fact that social media is a highlight reel, right? You see people posting photos of their they're big PR lifts, but you don't see people posting photos of all the failures it took them to get there, right? But what that does is it makes us feel like if I'm going to be doing XYZ activity, I have to be doing it to this level. I have to be competitive, or I have to be able to push myself to this point. And you don't. I mean, for your health, like for your basic health benefits from resistance training, you could be doing as little as one session a week for 20 minutes. You don't have to be out there doing, that crazy thing. And that resistance training again can look like a million different things. It just has to be, you pushing up against a force that is pushing back on you. That's it. And as long as you're doing that, you're doing something really good for your body when it comes to strength training.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting journey to go on, and I think one that's, you know, discovering things about yourself through that process, not necessarily thinking like, what happens if it all falls apart at some point? Um, and just kind of going into it. And I mean, I know you've talked about how your own journey has changed and how it's helped you overcome difficult things in your life, or maybe not overcome, but move through them.
Yeah.
You know, what were some of the, things that stood out to you, either with your own strength training journey or people that you talked to, in terms of navigating life challenges and or life changes that were really hard?
Yeah, when a big impetus for me writing this book and for me kind of leaning into strength training in the way that I did was that I had been strength training for 2 years and competing in strongman at the time. And I had my husband and I had just been starting to try to get pregnant. There was a day that I was working out in the gym and I was lifting an Atlas stone. And I remember feeling like more tired than I had in the past. And when I went home that day, I took a pregnancy test and I found out that I was pregnant. And then a couple of weeks later, I found out that I was miscarrying. And I very quickly went from this place of feeling the strongest I'd ever been in my entire life to suddenly feeling the weakest. And not just weak, but also like my body had somehow betrayed me, because I had for the last decade at that point sort of said to my body, okay, you are now this person who does hard things, and you run marathons and you do triathlons and you do weightlifting and you do all these things. And then I told my body it was the kind of body that would get pregnant and carry a baby, and it didn't listen to me. And it created this really significant level of distrust. But once I started to kind of continue with this routine of going back into the gym, with my coach and trying to do everything really safely as I was kind of going through all of this, it helped me kind of start to regain this feeling of trust and this feeling of capability in my body. And maybe it wasn't going to be capable of doing this particular thing that I wanted it to do yet, but it could still do all these other things. And one of the most powerful pieces of research that I found when I was doing this book was that I spoke to two different people who practice trauma-informed weightlifting, which is basically working with people who've gone through some kind of trauma and helping them use weightlifting to heal from that. So, that could be something as simple as, being able to feel the weight of something on your back and to stand up underneath that weight and to trust your body for that. For me, and I didn't know this at the time, to be clear, this is something I learned 5 years later when I started writing this book, and I didn't understand why strength training was so helpful. But what I came to understand was that when I was doing something like a heavy deadlift, I would have on my weight belts, right? And I would, to brace for that deadlift, I would kind of take that big breath and I would push into that belt. And if I was going to do that lift in a way that was going to keep me safe, I had to believe in the moment that I was going for that this part of my body that was the home of so much, sadness and vulnerability and this feeling of weakness was also actually a place of strength. And so in the act of doing that unconsciously, I was reminding myself that, you are actually really strong and you can deal with these hard things. And maybe in the end, nothing comes out the way that you want it to, but you know that you are capable of going through struggle. And that was on a personal level the most powerful thing that I learned. But I also spoke to all these athletes who, I mean, Strongman is full of people who have gone through something really, really hard in their life. And then they came to this sport because it showed them that they could handle that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And that's one of the reasons.
So powerful. I think it was amazing how you shared that story and everything around it in the book, and just such a great experience, overall in terms of being able to work through what you were going through. Not a great experience, of course, that it happened, but just
Yeah.
something really powerful to have there and work through those challenges. Just so
Yeah.
amazing. Anything else about writing this book or doing the research that you did or your own personal experience that really surprised you or you haven't mentioned yet that you thought was really impactful?
One of the things that was really kind of incredible for me was hearing these stories of vulnerability. And a lot of them came from the male athletes that I interviewed. I mean, there was this moment where I was at a strongman competition and I was interviewing someone outside in the parking lot. And one of the a 10-time or 11-time world's strongest man competitor who is now, I believe, in his 50s, came out. And the guy I was talking to kind of roped him into the interview and was like, "Hey, why did you get into strength training?" And I'm all of a sudden, both of us watched this, 6'4" maybe guy who is just built like a comic book villain start to tear up as he goes into explaining, going through an abusive childhood and wanting to kind of become strong enough that nothing could ever hurt him. And then ultimately realizing like you can't, that doesn't happen, right? But you can kind of use that to at least allow yourself to feel like you have some sort of agency over your life and what you're doing.
Mm.
And those stories were really incredible. Or kind of talking to people who compared strength training to this concept of compound interest, which I thought was a really interesting way to talk about it, where it's like, again, you go in and every time you put a little bit more on and a little bit more, and you're not starting from scratch. Sure, you're warming up from scratch, but every time you go in, you take that little gain that you've made the previous time and you build on that and you build on that and you build on that. And over time, you are showing yourself that, you can work really hard towards something and you can achieve it. And that is something that you don't just use in the gym. That is something that you take into work and into your social life and into every other aspect of your life because you've learned that that's something that you're capable of doing, and you see how the hard work that you do leads to the goals that you want to achieve. And that is, I think, one of the greatest things about it.
Yeah. It truly is seeing people making those strides, those improvements, and sometimes they're big jumps, and sometimes you just see, you keep plugging away, and when you look back and
Yeah.
see, where you've come and how you've grown, I mean, that's just the magic,
Yeah.
isn't it?
And listen, sometimes you go backwards. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think that if you asked me today to try to hit my PR deadlift, I couldn't do it. I'm not
Mhm.
trained for it right now. But I don't look at the lifts that I'm doing now that are less than that and go, ugh, look where I used to be. I
Mhm.
look at that now and I go, okay, I know what it took to get there last time. Is that the goal? If that's the goal, then all I have to do is just train this with more intention and more purpose, and I'll get back to that. And I think that is something, that I have used. I'm a freelance journalist, and one of the things that you deal with on a regular basis is that you are going to fail 99% of the time that you pitch something, right? But, what are the levers that I can pull to make it happen next time? What did I learn from that failure that I can now take into my next attempt? Um, and that is something I think the gym teaches you, that there's not a lot of other situations in life where you can put yourself intentionally in that situation of failing over and over again safely,
Mhm.
um, in a way that you learn something that translates everywhere else.
Mm. So well said. Like we'll end it there. Um, Tell the good people listening where they can get the book, where they can follow you, learn more about what you're up to, and just kind of dive in.
So Secrets of Giants is available, as far as I know, anywhere books are sold. Sometimes it'll be in person at your local Barnes and Noble, Indigo, what have you. Hopefully it's at your small bookstore. If not, you can ask them to carry it, but you can buy it online pretty much anywhere. And then you can find me. I'm pretty much across the board Alyssa Ages. So my website is Alyssa Ages, and then all of my social media handles are that as well. And I love connecting with people. So please, please reach out to me.
Amazing. It's been such a pleasure to have you on and talking about some of these different aspects of strength. You put into words and really looked at a lot of the research too, some of the things that I've always felt about strength training, but struggle to really get words for. It's such a
Thank
feeling
you.
sometimes, and describing it to another human is so hard. You're like, I don't know, it's just so great. And they're like,
Yes.
I don't know. I'll say like, lifting something heavy just kind of like pokes a part of my brain that feels so amazing. And people are like, what does that even mean? But for
Yes.
anybody who's looking for something more, a little bit more complete and sophisticated, and just so fascinating, all the things you wrote about in the book, the people you talk to, just paint such a rich picture of why strength is so amazing. So
Well,
thanks for
thank
doing the
you
work
so
that you did. I know it probably wasn't easy, but so appreciated. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks.